The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, muffling the chaotic pulse of 1908 Pittsburgh. Napoleon Hill stood in the threshold, his breath hitching as he felt the sheer weight of the room. This was not just an office. It was the command center of the world's wealth. Andrew Carnegie sat at the far end, motionless, his gaze fixed on the papers before him. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer against the floorboards. Hill took a step forward, the soles of his shoes striking the polished wood with a sharp, echoing rhythm. He felt the gravity of the encounter pulling at him, a silent pressure that made the air feel thick, almost electric. He had traveled miles to be here, yet in this silence, the distance felt infinite. Carnegie did not look up immediately, allowing the stillness to stretch until it tightened in Hill's chest. The man who held the keys to the industrial age was waiting. Hill steadied his pulse, forced his shoulders back, and moved toward the desk. He was a man with a notebook and a question, stepping into a room that would change the trajectory of his entire life. The meeting had begun. Carnegie finally moved. His hand, mapped with age and experience, slid a thick stack of documents across the oak surface. The paper whispered against the wood as it stopped exactly at the edge of the desk. Carnegie leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Hill's. He spoke of a secret mechanism, a hidden architecture of success that remained unmapped. He did not offer money. He offered a challenge. 20 years of his life spent tracking the giants of industry to reverse engineer their triumphs. Hill looked down at the stack. It was a mountain of work, a commitment that would strip away his youth and demand a singular, obsessive focus. There would be no paycheck to sustain him, only the promise of an answer that could change the world. Hill felt the air shift. This was the moment the path diverged. He could walk away, return to his old life, and remain a man of ambition without a target. Or he could reach out. He placed his hand on the documents. The weight was solid, real, and irreversible. He looked back at Carnegie and nodded. The deal was struck. 20 years of searching, starting now, with nothing but the burden of a question that had to be answered. The office door closed, and the silence of the room vanished, replaced by the relentless roar of the city. Napoleon Hill stepped onto the pavement, the cold wind cutting through his resolve. He held the notebook tightly, his knuckles white against the leather binding. He had no funding, no staff, and no map to find the elusive men Carnegie described. He stood at a busy intersection, watching the crowd surge past him like a river. Everyone moved with a destination. While he was just beginning to define his own, he ducked into a narrow alley to escape the press of the street, opening the notebook to the first blank page. He felt the hunger not for food, but for the answer hidden in the lives of the Titans. He looked at the empty paper, then back at the city skyline. It was a daunting, immense distance to cover, and he was entirely alone. He walked forward, turning his back on the familiar, his footsteps echoing against the brick. The journey had no clear start, no guaranteed finish, yet the hunger in his mind pushed him toward the first interview. He was no longer just a man. He was a searcher, and the hunt for the mechanism of success had officially begun. The laboratory smelled of ozone at lone-scorched metal. Napoleon Hill stood in the corner, his notebook open, as Thomas Edison gestured toward a workbench littered with twisted filaments. This was the 5th attempt in an hour. Each time, the glass bulb remained dark, a hollow shell of potential. Hill watched as Edison picked up a charred wire, his fingers stained with soot and iron dust. The silence between tests was heavy, punctuated only by the scrape of metal on stone and the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to measure nothing but wasted time. Hill stepped forward, helping to sweep away the debris of 1,000 failures. The floor was layered with broken glass, the remnants of ideas that had refused to take hold. Edison did not curse. He simply reached for another spool of wire, his movements precise and devoid of frustration. He had seen the darkness hold steady 1,000 times before. Hill recorded every detail. He watched the way Edison ignored the exhaustion pulling at his shoulders, the way he treated each failure not as a stop, but as a map of where not to go. The process was grueling, a relentless grinding of resolve against the stubborn reality of physics. Hill stood his ground, documenting the struggle, realizing that genius was not a sudden spark, but the sheer endurance to stay in the room when the light refused to appear. The air in the lab grew thin. Edison held the final filament, his hands steady despite the hours of silence. He connected the lead, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. Hill held his breath, his pen hovering over the ledger. Then, a low hum vibrated through the workbench. A thin, orange thread pulsed inside the glass once, twice, and then it held. A steady, white light flooded the workbench, washing out the shadows and the piles of broken glass. The room transformed in an instant. The exhaustion that had etched lines into Edison's face seemed to vanish, replaced by a calm, focused clarity. Hill looked from the glowing bulb to the debris on the floor. He realized then that the failures were not wasted time. They were the essential, invisible support for the light. Every broken piece had been a step toward this exact second. He wrote the truth down. Success is not the absence of darkness, but the persistence to hold the light until it finally catches. The bulb cast a long, sharp shadow of the notebook against the wall. Hill looked up, his gaze locked on the steady glow, knowing he had finally witnessed the mechanism he came to find. The factory floor at Highland Park was a cacophony of doubt. Henry Ford stood at the center of a half-built conveyor system, his hands resting on a steel beam. Around him, investors paced, their voices sharp with warnings about wasted capital and impossible logistics. They called the moving assembly line a fool's errand, a machine that would choke the life out of production. Ford did not raise his voice. He did not defend his theory with arguments. He simply walked to the starting lever. A group of financiers stepped forward, blocking his path, demanding he halt the project before the company collapsed under the weight of his obsession. Ford looked through them, his gaze fixed on the empty frame waiting at the head of the track. He pushed past the dissenters, his grip firm on the iron handle. He threw the lever. The chain drive groaned, then caught. A rhythmic clatter filled the building as the chassis began to slide forward, frame by frame, moving with a pace no manual labor could match. The critics fell silent. The noise of the machine swallowed their protests. Ford stood motionless as the line advanced, his eyes tracking the movement. He had heard the chorus of naysayers for months, and he had chosen to build anyway. Hill leaned against a support pillar, his pen moving rapidly across the page, documenting the quiet, absolute defiance of a man who refused to listen to the world. Back in his rented room, the pages felt like a weight. Hill spread his research across every surface, sketches of light, filaments, diagrams of conveyor belts, and endless lists of names. He had spent years hunting for the secret, yet the floor was littered with contradictions. How could a man who built machines and a man who mastered electricity share the same hidden engine? He paced the length of the room, his boots scuffing the floorboards. He picked up a page, then discarded it. The data was a blur of noise. He stopped near the window and leaned his forehead against the cool glass, letting the street sounds fade. He closed his eyes and stripped away the industries, the money, and the fame. Beneath the surface, the commonality emerged. It was not luck. It was not technical genius. It was a singular, ironclad focus. They did not drift. They did not negotiate with hesitation. They aimed. The chaos in his notes snapped into a clean, sharp line. He grabbed his pen, his hands steady for the first time in weeks. He wrote the words down, pressing hard enough to tear the paper. Definiteness of purpose. The fragmented years of research suddenly aligned, forming a single, coherent path forward. The search was over. The mapping had begun. Hill pulled a small, leather-bound ledger from his bag. It was worn at the corners, the spine softened by years of travel. He cleared the scattered loose papers from his desk, pushing them into a pile to make space for the book. This was the vessel. He opened it to the first blank page, the parchment thick and waiting. He dipped his steel-nib pen into the inkwell, watching a single black drop gather and hang. He did not rush. The act of writing was not merely recording, it was anchoring. He set the nib to the paper and began to transcribe the mechanics of success. The pen scratched a rhythmic, steady path across the page. Every line he drew felt like an iron link in a chain. When the nib caught on a rough fiber, he paused, took a breath, and carefully corrected the flow, refusing to let even a single letter waver. He was distilling a decade of chaos into a sequence of deliberate instructions. As the ink dried into a dark, permanent script, the abstract principles stopped floating in his mind. He took root on the page. He turned the leaf, checked the ink, and continued. The blueprint was finally taking shape, one calculated word at a time. Hill stared at the entry regarding failure. He had seen the titans of industry ridiculed, dismissed, and openly mocked by their peers. He had expected to find a secret internal peace, some quiet confidence that shielded them from the sting of rejection. He found none. Instead, he saw a deliberate, cold-blooded tactical choice. He stood up and paced the small room, his shadow stretching across the floor. The world was a constant barrage of reasons to stop, to quit, to fold. He realized that faith was not a warm sensation or a comforting feeling. It was a barricade. It was the conscious decision to ignore the evidence of the present in favor of a projected future. He stopped at the desk, looking at the ledger. He had been waiting for a sign, for a feeling of certainty to arrive, but it never came. He grasped the pen. He was not waiting for the world to change. He was choosing to ignore the naysayers. He wrote the word faith at the top of a new page, but he did not define it as hope. He defined it as a weapon. He stripped away the sentimentality. Faith was the act of holding a position when every external factor demanded retreat. He closed his eyes, felt the weight of the pen, and committed that choice to paper. Hill looked at the empty space on the page. He realized that if faith was a barricade against the world, then the mind itself was a filter. He began to experiment. He spoke a sentence aloud, asserting a condition he had not yet achieved. The sound of his own voice in the quiet room felt strange, but he did not stop. He repeated the phrase, forcing his brain to process the vibration of the words as if they were already factual. He observed the change. His posture straightened. His grip on the pen tightened. He was not just dreaming. He was programming his own perception. He recognized that men like Ford did not wait for the world to confirm their capacity. They dictated their capability to themselves until the world had no choice but to respond. Hill wrote the term autosuggestion in bold, sharp letters. He described the mind as a sieve. Every negative thought or external criticism that hit the filter was discarded, while every directive he fed himself passed through to his subconscious. He tested it again, closing his eyes and visualizing the final manuscript. He felt his pulse steady. He was not at the mercy of circumstances. He was the architect of his own reality. He documented the process with mechanical precision, turning his internal monologue into a repeatable, ironclad system for command. Hill moved his work to the city library, seeking the silence that only thousands of dead authors could provide. He carried his ledger into the stacks, where the air tasted of dry dust and brittle paper. The sheer volume of information pressed against him. He spent hours tracing the lives of inventors and financiers, his fingers skimming over records that dated back decades. The silence was heavy, a physical weight that made him feel small. Yet as he mapped the connections between these titans, a new pattern emerged. He realized he was not just reading history, he was observing a convergence. He laid his ledger flat on a scarred wooden table and began to outline the mastermind principle. He felt the presence of the men he studied, their drive, their failures, their methods, all contained within these shelves. The scale of it was immense. He cross-referenced the habits of industry leaders, noting how their intelligence was never singular, but always amplified by the circles they built. He wrote until the ink ran dry, his hand cramping from the pace. He was no longer just an observer. He was building a bridge between the genius of the past and the blueprint he needed to complete. He sat back, the library lights dimming, and listened to the quiet. The collective intelligence of a century seemed to hum in the room. And for the first time, he saw the mechanism clearly. Hill turned his attention from the books to the world outside the library walls. He watched how titans of industry operated. They did not work in isolation. They sought out rivals, experts, and critics, pulling them into their inner orbits. He noted the mechanics of these circles. It was not merely about gathering smart people in a room. It was about the friction created when different perspectives rubbed against one another. He observed a boardroom meeting where two men argued, their voices rising, their hands cutting through the air. Instead of breaking apart, they reached a new conclusion that neither could have formulated alone. Hill recorded this in his ledger with precision. He realized that a mastermind was a third entity, a separate intelligence born from the combination of two or more minds focused on a single, definite purpose. It was a catalyst. He saw how these leaders cultivated these groups, carefully selecting members who offered the missing pieces of their own expertise. The realization shifted his entire perspective. He was no longer looking for a solitary hero. He was looking for the architect of a collective force. He closed his ledger, his mind racing with the implications. No one stood alone. To achieve the impossible, a man had to build a circle that amplified his own potential, turning individual limitations into a shared, unstoppable momentum. The seasons blurred into a single, repetitive cycle. Hill looked up from his desk to find the calendar had flipped more times than he cared to count. His hair had thinned, and the joints in his hands stiffened in the morning cold. The ledger that once held his excitement now felt heavy, its pages thick with years of unyielding research. He walked to the window, watching the city change outside while he remained tethered to the same unfinished task. The promise he made to Carnegie in 1908 echoed in his mind, but it was no longer a golden ticket. It was a debt that demanded payment in time he could never recover. He returned to his desk, the wood scarred by years of ink spills and restless pacing. Every tick of the wall clock sounded like a gavel strike, marking the distance between his current reality and the goal he had set for himself. He tried to organize his notes, but the paper seemed to mock him with its sheer volume. The air in the room felt thick, stale with the residue of thousands of hours spent in pursuit of an answer that still felt just out of reach. He sat in the dim light, the silence of the room pressing against his chest, and realized the mission had become the only reality he knew. The letters arrived with rhythmic cruelty. Each one began with the same hollow regret, rejecting his manuscript as impractical. Hill stacked them on his desk, a growing monument to his own insignificance. The landlord knocked on his door, his voice muffled by the wood, demanding rent that Hill could not pay. He moved to the small kitchen, opening the cupboard to reveal nothing but a half-empty tin of tea and a stale crust of bread. The hunger was a persistent, dull ache in his stomach that distracted him from his notes. He looked at his desk, where the ledger lay open. To buy another week of time, he walked to the pawn shop, carrying his only remaining item of value. He traded it for a handful of coins that would barely cover his coffee and paper. Walking back through the rain, he saw the city lights glowing in windows where men sat in comfort, shielded from the struggle he was enduring. He reached his room, shivering, and sat back down at the desk. He picked up his pen. His fingers were numb, but he continued to write. The rejections were not just barriers. They were proof that he was challenging the status quo. He would not stop. He could not afford to. The final coin clattered against the floorboards, rolling into a dark corner where he could not reach it. Napoleon Hill knelt, his hand sweeping across the dust, but his fingers met only cold wood. He stood up, his breath hitching in the frigid air of the room. He checked his pockets again, turning them inside out, finding nothing but lint and a torn receipt. The room was silent, save for the distant, mocking sound of traffic outside. He walked to the desk, his movements sluggish and heavy. The ledger lay open, its pages filled with the observations of titans, the secrets of wealth, and the strategies of industry. Beside it, the ink pot was dry. A thin crust of residue coated the bottom, useless. He looked at the stack of pages, years of work, thousands of hours of observation, now nothing more than a pile of paper that had kept him from earning a single honest wage. His vision blurred. The walls seemed to draw inward, the space shrinking until the desk and the ledger were all that remained of his existence. He slumped into the chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and for the first time in 20 years, he did not reach for his pen. He simply stared at the blank wall, waiting for the silence to consume what was left of his resolve. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy weight pressing against his chest. Hill sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the empty inkpot. His hand rested on the edge of the ledger, his fingers tracing the indentation of words written years prior. "Faith is a deliberate choice." He whispered the phrase into the dark. The sound was thin, but it broke the paralysis. He stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room. He walked to the window, watching the city below. The same world that rejected him was still moving, indifferent to his struggle. He turned back to the desk, his jaw tight. He did not look for money. He did not look for praise. He reached into the drawer, pulled out the last remaining bottle of ink, and shook it until a single drop hit the nib. He did not need comfort. He needed a finish line. He sat down and pulled the manuscript toward him, The despair did not vanish, but he moved it aside, treating it like a physical obstacle to be stepped over. He dipped the pen. The first stroke of the new chapter cut across the page, sharp and certain. He was no longer waiting for the world to validate his work. He was forcing the world to acknowledge it. The typewriter sat on the desk like an engine waiting for ignition. Hill fed the first sheet into the carriage, the sound of the paper sliding against the platen loud in the small room. He struck the first key. The metal arm snapped against the ribbon, leaving a clean, dark mark. He typed slowly at first, his fingers finding the rhythm of his own thoughts. Then, the tempo accelerated. Clack, clack, clack. The mechanical sound filled the corners of the room, displacing the silence that had once held him prisoner. He did not pause to edit. He did not look back at the previous pages. He poured the observations of decades into the keys, the force of his keystrokes vibrating through the desk. Suddenly, the carriage jammed. He slammed his palm against the side of the machine, a sharp, jarring impact, and the mechanism clicked back into place. He did not stop to breathe. He leaned into the work, his eyes scanning the lines as fast as his hands could move. The rhythmic clattering became a roar. Page after page piled up on the floor, a growing white mountain of finalized intent. He was no longer just writing. He was building a structure that would outlast the night. The momentum was a physical force, pulling him forward, refusing to let him stop until every principle was captured in ink. The final key struck the platen with a dull thud. Silence rushed back into the room, more profound than before. Hill pulled his hands away, his fingers cramped and stained with ink. He did not move for a long time. The machine ticked as the metal cooled. He leaned forward, scanning the last page, reading the words he had spent 20 years chasing. They were not about gold. They were not about the accumulation of objects. He saw the blueprint for the architecture of the human mind. He realized then that he had not written a ledger of success, but a manual for the invisible force that governs every action. He stood up, his legs stiff, and walked to the door, then turned back to look at the stack of paper on the desk. It was heavy with the weight of thousands of interviews, failures, and hard-won truths. The greed he had once associated with the titans of industry vanished, replaced by the clarity of the principle itself. This was a tool for the will, a way to map the terrain of one's own thoughts. He picked up the stack, squared the edges against the desktop, and felt the gravity of it. He was finished. The blueprint was no longer a dream. It was a physical testament to the power of a decided mind. The manuscript left the desk and entered the stream of time. Look at the structures rising in the city today. See the woman who refuses to abandon her prototype despite the 11th failure. Watch the technician who adjusts the assembly line, ignoring the noise of critics to find a more efficient path. These are not coincidences. They are the living echoes of the blueprint. In every field, there is someone who sets a goal, focuses their intent, and ignores the friction of the crowd. They do not wander. They aim. You see it in the way a doctor studies the same case for the 100th time, looking for the detail others missed. You see it in the artist who scrapes the canvas clean to start again, driven by a vision that has not yet materialized. The principles of definiteness and autosuggestion are not locked in the pages of a book. They are etched in the sweat of the modern achiever. They exist in the quiet discipline of the worker who shows up when others stay home. They survive in the hands of those who treat their own thoughts as the primary tool of their trade. The legacy is not a paper archive. It is a kinetic, ongoing process that repeats every time a human being chooses to persist against the weight of the world. The story of the ledger ends, but the mechanism remains. You stand at the same desk now. The tools are not ink and paper, but your own attention and the focus you apply to your next hour. Every outcome begins with a choice that happens before a single muscle moves. You decide the path. You act as the guardian of your own thoughts, filtering out the noise that tells you to settle for less. When you encounter the same friction that stalled the Titans, you recognize it not as a wall, but as a test of your resolve. Do not look for permission. Do not wait for the external conditions to align. The blueprint requires only your commitment to the aim. Silence the doubt. Fix your eyes on the result. Take the first step while the room is still quiet and the world is still asleep. Stand up. Walk to the door. Open it. The path is yours to carve. The work is waiting. Your success is not a future event, it is the choice you make in this exact second. Begin.